Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 246. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about Ukraine and Iraq. Lots of important information on today's show. Be sure you share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We republish it on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find it on our social media accounts at Facebook and Twitter. The Twitter handle is @con_interest. You can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. And you can check out the video version and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. If you would like to donate to the show, you could do that at Patreon and Subscribestar. We also take crypto. All that information is in the show notes page, as well as the information for our great sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE, and they have a bunch of great high quality products at Paloma Verde. They publish the lab test results right there on their website. We've had a partnership with Paloma Verde for well over a year now at Conflicts of Interest, and every amount of feedback I've gotten from listeners has been absolutely fantastic. They found the Paloma Verde helpful for themselves, helpful for their dog, whatever it may be. They find a lot of benefits in the calming side, the de-inflammation side of the CBD. So whatever you got going on, there's probably some way that CBD could help you to improve your life. So go check out what they got at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE when you check out. They'll save you 20% and it'll get the show kickback. All right, let's get into the episode. And as the past couple of weeks of the show have gone, starting off with Ukraine, and we're going to start with the fighting going on within the country, and then zoom out as we have. So first off is the capital city of Kiev, where if you're listening to the mainstream media, they're saying that the city is surrounded. Now, it may be very hard for people to get out of the city. I'm not sure about that. But when they say it's surrounded, I'm somewhat skeptical because every map I'm looking at, the pro-Ukrainian ones that, you're getting from more sources that are favorable to the government in Kiev, are even only putting out maps that show the city surrounded on the top half of the city. So if you draw a circle around Kiev and you're looking at a clock from 9 to 3 o'clock, that's pretty much all controlled by Russia outside of the city. However, on any of the other maps I'm seeing, they're just not controlling the southern half of the city. Now, the city is, at least to some extent, split by the Dnieper River, and so depending on how many bridges have been destroyed, either by Ukraine in order to, strategically prevent Russia from being able to push the offensive, or by Russia for, trying to limit the ability of the Ukrainian forces to move around within the city or something like that. These things happen, and it makes it really hard for certain people to get certain places in the city and to be able to escape. And so it may be very difficult to get from the northern half of the city to the southern half. Or I do see, if you look on the outskirts of the city, it looks like maybe there's subdivisions or neighborhoods, suburbs of Kiev that are being surrounded by Russian forces as they take more of that territory. And so it's possible when they say, it's surrounded, they're talking about a smaller area and not the entire city, because at least at this point, again, if you're looking at the maps, there's just no way you could say that Kiev is surrounded at this point. There seems to be some fighting going on around the outskirts of Kiev, but in a general sense, it doesn't seem like that city has faced the level of fighting that some of the eastern cities have faced. And now we'll talk about Mariupol, which is along the Sea of Azov coast. If you're looking at a map of Ukraine, split the difference between the Donbass region and the Crimean Peninsula along the Sea of Azov, and I think right about there is where you'll find this city. They say that 125,000 people have gotten out of that city through the humanitarian corridors, and that has to be a huge sigh of relief and great news. Now, there are, I think, 200,000 people estimated trying to get out of this city of 400,000 people. And so this is still significant, even if you're only looking at the rough numbers that would leave about 75,000 people in the city who want to get out. Not to mention that, of the other 200,000 who are apparently going to stay, Some of them could be men who are conscripted and aren't legally allowed to leave by the Ukrainian government. And so, they could be forced there, but actually want to flee. And, other people who are tied to them who, choose not to leave them behind or something like that could be a part of the 200,000 people that are staying. And so it's not just like the remaining people are all fighters or anything like that. My guess is that a significant portion of them are civilians or civilian conscripts, and maybe people who are stuck in the city they aren't going to fight anybody who comes onto their territory. And as I've said on the show, and as I've talked about with other war zones around the world, you could label these people militants, but it kind of then underestimates how destructive this was for the civilians of this country. I guess I would feel like, if some tanks were rolling, like, down the street that I live on, and I, leaned out my door and started firing, Molotov cocktails or, rounds at the tanks or the troops on my street, I'm still kind of a civilian. I'm just defending my own home here. Now, it gets different when you're talking about people who are choosing to join up and then they deploy to different areas and things like that. But if we're just talking about conscripts or just talking about people defending their homes, just merely having a gun, I don't think really disqualifies you completely from being a civilian. Although I guess, combatant versus non-combatant is maybe how they would throw the two categories or something like that. But even then, when you're literally defending your own property, it just seems so unfair to not count those deaths as, just civilians who were killed by this war. So fighting in the city is ongoing. There's a report that all kinds of critical infrastructure are being hit. We broke down the attack on the hospital on the last show. I have no other details on that. I was looking before I went on and recorded, but it kind of seems that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, that there were definitely, people in that building who were receiving medical care, and one woman who was pregnant at least was pictured, and you could verify that at least prior to this war that she was pregnant. So it's probably a pretty good chance that, she was receiving maternity care in this hospital when it was hit by Russia. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't an Azov office or battalion or somewhere, in one of those buildings that the hospital was also in. But at the same time, that is still a pretty sick thing to do. And this is what we see and condemn all the time from the Saudis, the Americans, the Israelis attacking, whether it's Gaza, Yemen, or Iraq or something like that. They'll hit these facilities and then they'll say, oh, but there's a terrorist inside, and so we had to do it. And no, it's just disgusting. Now, it does seem that for the most part, Russia does have control over the corridor between the Crimean Peninsula on the Donbass region, connecting with Russia proper along the Sea of Azov. There is reports of fighting going on in the city, so, pockets, holdouts, and things like that are still going on. But at the same time, it doesn't look like there's really a put together band of resistance still holding out in the city. Russia holds, if not the whole city, most of it at this point. And then we have the Donbass region itself, where Russian media and, well, other media too, but media from, the Donbass or Russian sources are saying that 20 people were killed by a missile strike in one of the cities in the Donbass. This is 100% believable. There's some, video footage and stuff like that. I can't say that it's absolutely confirmed, but these are the kinds of things that have been happening in the Donbass for 8 years. And one of the important things about this is to understand that I think this is a big part of why the war has spread so much into the rest of Ukraine, is because, again, these kind of attacks have been going on for quite a long period of time. Now, so if you're, looking at Ukraine, the Dnieper River splitting the country in the east, along the border with Belarus, there's some pretty other significant cities. Kharkiv, I think is how you say it. It looks like it's about to or has fallen to Russian, as well as a few other somewhat important cities there. And then Odessa in the south along, so again, this time you're going from the Crimean Peninsula out towards the east, or I guess that would be west, towards the Black Sea, and then Moldova. And if you look there, you could see that Russia has made offensives in this area, and everybody's assumption is that they're going to take Odessa. There's been reports several times that Russia was moving on the city, but if you look at the Russian troop movements, they actually seem to be moving more north than west. And so, while it would be easy to say maybe this is just a part of the offensive for Odessa, they're just looking to like cut out a big block around the city or something like that. We don't know what the plan there is yet. And so maybe an attack on Odessa is coming in the coming days, but it's possible it's not. And maybe they're more concerned about moving north towards Kiev or even the cities in the west, where in western Ukraine has been the least targeted portion of the country. Again, look at some of the maps of the Russian offensive. You see, moving most heavily in the east out of the Donbass, south from Belarus, north from the Crimean Peninsula, along the Sea of Azov, and down towards Kiev. But cities in the west that there's been some strides, particularly near military bases and things like that, but there's been overall less attacks. And so there was an attack near the city of Lviv, which is near the Polish border, on a military base. And let's see, I wrote this one up at antiwar.com. Russia targets Ukrainian base housing foreign fighters. Russia hit Ukraine's Yarviv military complex with dozens of cruise missiles Sunday morning, killing 35. The New York Times reports the facility was being used to coordinate and train foreign fighters entering Ukraine. The U.S. condemned the attack on the base located just miles from the Polish border. And when I looked it up on the map, it seemed like the number given by like Al Jazeera and stuff was a little bit more accurate, that this base is 20 to 25 miles away from the Polish border. Some of the American sources were putting it at about 10 miles. Nonetheless, I mean, it's pretty close, especially when you're considering that they fired 30 cruise missiles. My guess is that they came in from, hundreds of miles away. And so it isn't impossible that they would go off course in something like that. We had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan appearing on Face the Nation and a couple other Sunday morning shows. So I'll have some other quotes from Sullivan later here. But in regards to this, he says, if Russia strikes hit a NATO nation, the full force of the NATO alliance to bear in responding to it. Sullivan said that Putin ordered the strikes near the Polish border out of frustration that his invasion has slowed. So the host, Margaret Brennan of Face the Nation, did ask Sullivan, well, what would happen if it were an accident? If a Russian, they're trying to hit this base, it goes 20 miles off course and lands, 5 kilometers into Kiev, or into Poland, then what happens? And Sullivan did not commit to an answer. He said something very wishy-washy that sounded like, well, if a missile hits one of these countries, then we will react to it. But he didn't actually say that even if it's a mistake, we would go right ahead. Now, Russia offered a little bit different, I guess, accounting of the base, saying they destroyed a large cache of foreign weapons, and they claim to have killed 184 mercenaries in the attack. So it is interesting that Russia is putting the number so much higher than the government in Ukraine is. I suppose both sides have a pretty good reason to either, lie in one direction or the other. If you are Ukraine, this morning they actually updated it and said they have 20,000 people interested in coming and fighting. That's a decent sized fighting force, especially if these people, like a lot of the reports that I've read of Americans, Canadians, Brits interested in fighting for the Ukrainian government. They're people with previous military experience, sometimes special forces, and so this could be a significant fighting force coming in, entering the country on the behalf of Ukraine. And so Russia could be looking to inflate that number in order to scare people off. Ukraine could be looking to artificially suppress that number in order to, make sure people aren't worried about coming to Ukraine, because again, that those could be important foreign fighters. Now, as of Sunday, when the attack happened, there were about 1,000 foreign fighters at that base, and it's unclear who else was there. According to some sources, it's also known as the International Peacekeeping and Security Center. I mean, what an Orwellian name for a military training complex that is, but that is where Ukraine stations its peacekeepers that it deploys for the UN, and those people apparently did come home when this war started. And so it could be that there's far more people at this complex who than just the 1,000 foreign fighters, and who knows who was actually killed here. The nationalities of those kills has not been released or claimed by either Kiev or Moscow. Now, the New York Times also reported that, they had a journalist source who is familiar with the base, and said that the structures that were hit were previously used by the American and Canadian military trainers. My guess is that this would include the Florida National Guard before they were removed from Ukraine mid-February, but it's not exactly 100% clear who that was that was training here. Now, in one sense, I guess my initial thoughts were, if that's where the Americans and the Canadians were, then maybe that's where the English-speaking foreign fighters went, just because my assumption would be that there are things in that building that are written in English, which, may be helpful for people where this is a pretty large military facility, and if it's largely used for just Ukrainians, other buildings may not have as much dual language kind of stuff, or I guess not just English to Ukrainian. So for that reason, I'm somewhat suspect that maybe the American weapons or the Western weapons were ending up in this particular building, or possibly even Canadians, Brits, maybe Americans who are going to fight for Ukraine were going to be stationed here, because again, English building. Now, I think that's what I have on the fighting. Oh, then the journalist that was killed. There's reports that seem pretty well confirmed that an American journalist, videographer, was killed. First of all, pretty much exclusively, the people who do go to war zones and do this kind of reporting are doing some pretty brave work. Now, I do think there's a line between, say, like a Richard Engel and some Bill Roggio or something like that, where one really pushes more and gets more important information, and the other one just seems to be like reading off statements from various government sources, not really in danger but near the front lines. And so, but this guy, seemed like he was one of the guys that put himself in danger. The stories that I've read about this, I want to get more information before I go into this too much. It does seem that it was Russian fighters that were the ones to have opened fired here. However, just looking at all the sources, I would like to, see a little bit more detail here, and that these guys were journalists who were attacked. Maybe, hopefully, some video or something. Even if I don't want to see the guy die, but leading up to the event, maybe we could figure out what happened and why journalists were fired upon. Sullivan said the U.S. will respond to this, even though it's not exactly clear, to any significant degree what actually happened yet here. So next, let's move on and talk about civilian casualties. The UN says over 1,000 people killed or injured, with 560 killed, including 40-something children. These numbers really haven't moved all that much from Thursday's show. I'm not sure if that is more of a UN thing where they're just working on how they're going to either publish the data or count the data, and so they're not putting out a whole lot of new stuff, or maybe as the fighting has entered more urban areas, for whatever reason, it's harder to get to and count those deaths in a timely manner. And then the other possibility is just, for whatever reason, less people are getting killed, whether it's the 125,000 people from Mariupol escaping through the humanitarian corridor, Or maybe, Russia just hasn't pushed like offensives around Kiev and other Ukrainian cities fast enough that civilians have been stuck in their homes in great numbers. And so the fact that Russia is moving slow on this offensive could in some way account for the fact that, again, 156 or 160 plus people, according to the UN, have been killed at this point, which, if you're looking at the damage done, if you compare it to previous U.S. like campaigns, they estimate, I think, 15,000 civilians were killed in the U.S. shock and all the first 3 weeks of the Iraq War. I mean, this would be significantly less than that, right? That, if we're talking about 500, the number could be higher. It could, even if it's 1,000, right? Even if we double it and there's 1,000 people killed, that's significantly and meaningfully lower than the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so even though you see quite a bit of destruction or and stuff like that, there could be actions that, both Russia and Ukraine, but particularly Russia, are taking to not just slaughter civilians writ large. But we will obviously find out more information as time moves on, as the counts get more accurate, and we find out if the thing here is more just an undercount and that's the cause, or if there really is something going on in the fighting where, I'm not saying that, oh, Russia only killed 500 people, that's no big deal at all. No, this is absolutely horrific. But at the same time, again, if you're looking at the damage done, if you're looking at, again, what other military offensives, how many civilians they have killed, this does seem to be less. And so if you're asking why, maybe that's it. A slower Russian offensive. Ukraine, it has said that I think 2,200 people were killed recently in Mariupol. Not sure if they are saying that those were all civilians or not, but obviously if that number is even remotely true, then the overall death count in Ukraine is far higher than the UN is currently reporting. Ukraine says 1,300 of its soldiers were killed. My guess is that's at least a little bit of an undercount, if not a significant undercount. Again, it also depends on how you want to count these numbers. If Ukraine is saying all their conscripts are civilians, or anybody who's shooting and throwing Molotov cocktails at tanks are all civilians, and not counting any of those people among this 1,300 dead, then maybe this is a little closer to the number of actual uniformed soldiers that were killed. Are they counting Azov guys in this? I don't know. These are the questions that we have to ask, and the things that we just don't know about this warfare at this point. All right, now let's talk about TOTS. And a lot of stuff going on here. We have maybe the most significant announcement on the TOTS issue coming from Russia. I also wrote this one up at antiwar.com yesterday. Russia opened to TOTS, but conditions have changed. Prior to invading Ukraine, Moscow offered the West a series of security proposals to avert conflict in Europe. A senior Russian diplomat says the offer is now invalid, but the Kremlin remains open to TOTS with Washington. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rabkov announced the policy shift on Saturday, saying that any new arms control talks will come under new terms. The senior official added that Russia and the U.S. remain in constant contact. The following day, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said that Russia has shown a willingness to have real serious negotiations. While this is the first encouraging sign for bilateral diplomacy since Russia began its offensive in Ukraine in late February, both sides expressed pessimism. Sherman said that Washington believes Vladimir Putin is intent on destroying Ukraine. Likewise, Rabkov said the Kremlin assessed the U.S. wasn't serious about negotiations. Russia offered the security proposal to Western powers in mid-December and demanded a written response. The U.S. and NATO delivered them to Russia a month later, though Moscow was unhappy with the answer it got. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the blot showed unwillingness to negotiate on only showed a willingness to negotiate on secondary issues, and therefore wasn't taking the Russian red line seriously. Among Russia's primary concerns in the red lines include NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine, while it sought to have the U.S. remove its strategic missile launchers from Eastern Europe. And there, of course, we're talking about the Patriot missile batteries that could fire the interceptor missiles, the Patriot interceptors, but also Tomahawk missiles, which can be equipped with nuclear warheads. Now, we also had Sullivan say that the U.S. was open to engaging in talks with Russia if Ukraine were to find it helpful. Now, this is absolutely stupid. This is the same thing that we have seen in Yemen, for example, where the U.S. allows its proxies, like the Ukrainian government, like the government of Saudi Arabia, dictate terms that the U.S. is willing to talk on. The U.S. should be initiating the talks with Russia here, trying to, one of the primary concerns is to get a ceasefire in Ukraine, stop the death, and eventually lead to a Russian withdrawal. But the U.S. should not be saying that, we're just going to do this on behalf of the Ukrainians. They should be taking the initiative because a lot of Russia's issues, a lot of the reasons for this invasion are a lot bigger than Ukraine, like the strategic missile launchers, like the deployment of NATO forces all the way to Russia's border, even in the Baltic states, the amount of advanced weaponry we've put and deployed, the training missions in Poland and Romania and these other Black Sea states are real issues for Russia. And so, the U.S., I think, actually has a lot of room to give where we could make concessions that have little to do with Ukraine. Obviously, Ukrainian neutrality will have to be a part of it. To be honest, the Americans should really be leaning on the Ukrainians to, I would say, at the very least, recognize Crimea as Russian. That's never going back. But also to recognize the independence of the Donbass. As much as they may not like giving up, their territory and things like that, the fact that for the past 8 years a civil war has been fought there and the Donbass has either been independent or more treated as just a portion of Russia, means that territory has kind of been established as non-Ukrainian over the past decade. And so, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia should just get it. But if you're looking at from the American side, you're looking for an end to this conflict, putting some pressure on Ukraine there, and then making concessions that don't cost Ukrainians anything. Moving the Patriot missile battery systems out of Eastern Europe, moving troops out of the Baltic states, agreeing not to continue, conduct training missions in the Black Sea, in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, are all things that could be done that come at little or absolutely no cost to the Ukrainian government that America could make concessions on, and we're not even seeing any interest in having talks around this. Any talks are just, whatever the Ukrainian state wants. This is absurd. We also have the U.S. warning China. This one from myself and Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. We title it, White House Threatens China Will Pay a Price for Support for Russia. China will face major consequences should it help Russia evade ever-growing raft of American sanctions. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned just days before he's set to meet with Beijing's top diplomat in Rome. Sullivan's warning on Sunday came soon after Western officials told the New York Times and Washington Post that Russia is seeking weapons and economic relief from China amid the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. A spokesperson for the Chinese government said they were unaware of such requests, while Moscow is yet to confirm the reports. And so, very important on the Washington Post and New York Times stories that we have no confirmation that any of that is true. My guess is that Russia and China have a very deep relationship that's been increasingly, they've carried out joint training missions and stuff like that recently. And so it shouldn't be a complete surprise if there is some economic and military trade and ties going on between the two states. And so whether this is something new, an increase or not, is yet to be seen. And again, since we only have unnamed officials, that is the case. However, it does seem that the statements from the unnamed officials are being taken very seriously in the Biden administration because prior to this week, the U.S. threats towards China on this, or prior to Sullivan's statement, the U.S. pressure on China on this has been limited to being communicated privately and directly, where now it's being made public that the U.S. has made this threat. So despite the pressure to join in on the sanctions spree, Chinese President Xi Jinping has stated that Beijing's relationship with Russia even exceeds an alliance in its closeness and effectiveness, as President Biden has ruled out direct military action in Ukraine. The administration has instead focused on arming the country's military while attempting to make Russia an international pariah in the diplomatic and economic spheres. China has so far been able to obstruct Biden on both counts. Beijing's UN delegation is supporting Russia's claim that U.S.-funded labs in Ukraine were working on chemical and biological weapons, a charge rejected by Washington as a conspiracy theory, and is now calling for an international investigation. Chinese financial support could also help Russia to weather the storm as its economy struggles to adapt to punishing Western sanctions. While the U.S. National Security Advisor is set to meet with Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi on Monday, for a long-planned follow-up to Biden's call with Xi late last year, the sit-down is unlikely to produce much in the way of results. The U.S. officials say the meeting is centered on efforts to manage the competition between our two countries, but a source familiar with the matter told Politico that it is not about negotiating any specific issues or outcomes, but will instead focus on Russia's unjustified and brutal war against Ukraine and how China has aligned itself with Russia in advance of their own world order. Now, here's the part where this is really problematic, right? So, I guess I don't want to just compare the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the U.S. wars in the Middle East all the time, because I don't think that's necessarily helpful. And, there are people suffering and dying in Ukraine. And if all you could say about that is, well, it's worse than Yemen, that's not necessarily helpful. However, if the U.S. government is going to go to China and they are going to say, it is unbelievable that you are supporting the Russian invasion this way, it is disgusting and despicable, the Chinese should laugh in the American faces, because we are doing far worse things too. And so when this is coming from the American government, particularly to other governments, I think this is going to ring extremely hollow and be completely an ineffective method of of trying to conduct diplomacy or talks or anything like that. It's so obviously hypocritical. The U.S. is so obviously doing and supporting worse things all over the world. It's not just like I could point to Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, or something like that. There are a lot of other places where the U.S. is heavily involved in killing a lot of people. If you look at the sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and North Korea. I mean, these are significant. These are punishing the people to the point people are starving to death. Afghanistan may be the worst right now. And, all the finger pointing that we're doing and talking about how horrible the invasion of Ukraine is, and it is. Joe Biden's starvation campaign in Afghanistan this winter could kill far more people than Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And so, there's something that really does bother me so much when we're paying so much attention to what's happening in Ukraine and we're starving more people to death in Afghanistan. It's really disturbing. So, that's most of what I have on Tots, I guess. There were some reports that potentially Israel could be a host for a new round of talks, but there was a report from the Ukrainian government that their foreign minister rejected a call or talks with the Israeli foreign minister Yair Lapid because Israel is pushing Ukraine pretty hard to negotiate a way out of this. And so, maybe Israel here feels more like they need to maintain their relationship with Russia because of their bombing campaign in Syria, because of the huge number of Russians, people from Russia who emigrated to Israel and now live as dual citizens and things like that. Uh, but that is also the case in Ukraine as well, where there's a lot of Jewish Ukrainians who have emigrated to Israel over the past several decades. And so I'm not sure why Israel is pushing Ukraine so hard. It could also be that Israel sees a real resolution here. Maybe they see that Russia is offering what they see should be considered as an acceptable deal for Ukraine, and they're trying to put the pressure on Ukraine that America is unwilling to bring some kind of resolution to this conflict. One their story on this, the U.S., again, warned Russia about potential cross-border attacks and things like that. There was apparently a stray drone that ended up in Croatia. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about this story because it apparently flew over a significant amount of NATO airspace before landing in Croatia, and detonating I don't think intentionally, maybe it like landed and exploded and damaged 40 vehicles. Luckily, nobody killed there. But again, I am still a little skeptical of this story just because it seemed this drone flew a very long way before it landed and then exploded. It seems like somebody maybe should have caught it beforehand. The authorities said that the drone pieces suggest it could be from either country. I don't know. I kind of suspect, I guess, that they're not freaking out more about this, that it was probably a Ukrainian drone. But maybe, what happens is like once these drones like end up kind of just being on a straight line, like, they're just going, right? They don't have control over them anymore for whatever reason. And, but without the sending and receiving signals or something, it's harder for these other governments to detect them. I'm not sure, but it's really weird that this drone was able to apparently fly so far before exploding. However, just see the kind of thing that, imagine this had killed 40 people instead of damaged 40 cars. I mean, we could be talking about a different scenario now where the U.S. is saying that this somehow violated Article 5 or something like that. All right, I do want to talk about the chemical weapon labs before I move on, just because there are accusations of false flags being exchanged between the U.S. and Russia. Both sides are saying that the other is going to use a chemical weapons false flag. It's possible that both sides would do this. In these cases, I guess my suspicion is always not exactly state actors and radical elements would be the most willing to do this and on the losing side, right? So if you're Russia and you carry out a chemical weapons attack within Ukraine, I see little benefit of using chemical weapons versus using larger bombs. If you just carry out cruise missile attacks, yeah, everybody's going to freak out. Maybe it's a cost thing. Maybe the chemical weapons are just going to be so much cheaper, something like that. But if you use even dumb bombs to kill people while the West is going to panic, they're very clearly not going to get involved. If you do take the step of using chemical weapons, there are international treaties, there are issues that people have. Some countries like Iran do react more seriously to chemical weapons attacks because they have been subject to them, and so this could become a problem for Russia. My guess too is that if the Ukrainian government did it, it would become a problem for them. If the Azov battalion did it, maybe not so much. So that's kind of my thought. If chemical weapons are used, that would be my first guess, would be extremist elements on the Ukrainian side in an attempt to draw in Western powers to the conflict to help them win this war. But we don't know yet, and it could not happen. What was happening in these labs, it does seem that they exist. That seems pretty much 100% conclusive now. No longer a conspiracy theory to say that there were biological and chemical labs in Ukraine that at least received some funding from the United States. Questions I have, remaining are, what percentage of the funding was coming from the United States, and then exactly, how much control did the US have over these laboratories? Why was the project started in the first place? My guess was, as we get the narrative from the Americans coming out, it's going to go something like this. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there was all these really dangerous labs, and the Ukrainians couldn't afford to, move all this stuff, and it's really dangerous to move. And so the safest thing to do was just to develop labs around these areas to monitor these agents. And then they're going to say, well, we had to experiment on them to make sure that the, Russians weren't working on something that we didn't know about. And so then, they essentially just developed the weapons as what they call a defensive measure. But we still don't know everything here. And again, as I point out in the China article, China is now calling for an international investigation. I am not hopeful that an international investigation will net anything here. My assumption is it'll be the OPCW that will carry out this investigation. And as we have seen from Syria, they are deep in the pocket of the Western powers. And so, maybe there are honest people within the OPCW, as, with the Duma chemical weapons attack, people came out, leaked the truth. And thanks to that, in Aramate in the gray zone, we now know the truth of what, happened in Duma, Syria, that wasn't a chemical weapons attack. However, that took years to come out, right? And so the very dangerous. This is a very long time for all this to be up in the air. So many narratives could be crafted by each side. And it's important to remember that everybody's at war now, right? The US is at war, Ukraine's at war, Russia is at war. And so all these states have propaganda reasons to push this, right? They want to make their war effort as strong as possible. And the threat of chemical weapons, I think, is a thing that generally does rally public support to the cause of war. And so, again, all sides have an incentive here to do this. And I'm just really hoping that nothing comes out of it, and that we could discover the truth of what the US was doing in these labs. My hope is they weren't developing chemical weapons, but if I had to just guess now, they are going to say they were developing defensive measures, which is the same thing as developing offensive chemical weapons and then trying to figure out what they would do in response to that. All right, that is what I have on the Ukraine situation today. Let's see, anything else I want to mention about that? I don't think so. I hope people are listening to all the coverage I'm doing on Ukraine and not just the one episode. I don't want to go through every single time and explain the Azov battalion and all this kind of stuff. And I also don't want to reduce all my coverage and focus all my coverage on just the neo-Nazis, because, there's millions, tens of millions of people in Ukraine that are just regular people that were just trying to live their lives and have now come under a foreign invasion from Russia. All right, before I wrap today, I do want to take a second to talk about this attack by Iran on the Iraqi city of Erbil. This is in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it apparently happened near a U.S. consulate that either wasn't complete or wasn't staffed, I believe, but I don't think it actually hit the consulate. Iran is saying that they targeted a Mossad facility, and it seems possible that this was the case. However, the Iranian government could have gotten this wrong. It's entirely possible they thought it was some kind of Mossad facility and wasn't. Mossad is Israeli intelligence, by the way. It's also possible, they were given false or bad information. Or, they really did hit some kind of Mossad facility here. Iran says it was in response to Israel killing 2 members of the IRGC with an airstrike in Syria. And, it's going to be interesting to see, how all this plays out, right? Because there's so much going on here. There's the Iran-Israel issue. There's the Iran-Russia ties. There's the overall negotiations with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. There's the war in Syria, where Iran is allied with Assad, and Russia and Israel carries out attacks in Syria at least once a week, if not more. And Those attacks regularly erode the ability of the Syrian military to take care of the jihadist threat in that country and also target Iranian sites. And so there's a lot of complicated factors here, right? And I'm not exactly sure how this is all going to play out. In one sense, it looks like maybe with this strike, Iran is kind of saying that even if this means the end of the nuclear deal, with the the current sanctions against Russia and everything like that, they're kind of fine falling on that side of the fence and not returning to the deal, which is dangerous, somewhat understandable. At the same time, maybe Iran feels they are very close to returning to this deal. Maybe they feel like they have secured, something from the Americans that basically says the JCPOA is going to be enacted and remain without factoring in the direct Iran Israel feud back and forth issues, right? The those two sides killing each other are going to that's going to happen, but the Americans aren't going to let it get in the way of the Iran nuclear deal. I don't see that working out if that's the strategy here. The Hawks in the America are going to throw an absolute fit over this and demand Iran face all kinds of different consequences. Maybe one of the only fortunate things about the timing of this is everybody is so consumed with what's going on in Ukraine that I think to the American people it seems overwhelming when you now want to wage a war against Iran too. And so I think it's kind of unlikely the Hawks push too much for a response here, particularly because no one was killed or even injured, I believe. Last thing on this from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. We have Jade Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, condemning the attack on Erbil and saying the U.S. is working to get missile defense systems to Iraq. As Ditz points out, there's a lot of questions about how the hell this will work. Are we going to give these missile defense systems to the Kurds? Are we going to give it to the government in Baghdad? If we do give it to the government in Baghdad, why would they actually use it to defend Iraqi Kurdistan? Is the U.S. just going to deploy it like to their consulate building in Erbil? How will the Iranians respond to this? So many questions about how this is going to play out. But I do think it's a major threat of some kind of escalation cycle in Iraq between the U.S., Iran, Israel, and probably the Iraqis will end up paying the biggest price for that, with the destruction to their country and civilian casualties there, as well as the Syrians, where the Israelis like to deal their blow to the Iranians. Same with the Americans, I think, take advantage of that in Syria. All right. That's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Sorry the show's out a little bit late today. I'm an American, so I'm just gonna blame daylight savings time. But also busy weekend. I went to the Colorado Libertarian Party convention. I got to meet a ton of people who said that they loved the show, and it was such a cool experience. So anybody who I met this week, I had such a great time, and thank you all so much for telling me that you appreciate the work we're doing here. It was really cool. And then, of course, for the convention to go well, successful, just make new friends, stuff like that, and also get to meet Dave Smith, and he gave a great talk. So that was great, and looking forward to getting out to more events in the coming months, meeting more people who like the show, and doing more kinds of stuff like that. So anyways, share the show, support the show, and I'll be back with more shows later in the week.